You can hear the guards laughing through the stone. Your wrists are raw from the iron. The cell smells like rot and fear, like something died here long before you arrived. You're 19 years old. 2 years ago, you didn't know how to hold a sword. Now you're the reason English commanders wake up terrified, the reason a broken kingdom found its spine again. But none of that matters anymore. They got you. And what they're about to do won't happen on a battlefield. It'll happen in a courtroom with documents and theology and questions designed like bear traps. You think the law will save you. That's the first mistake. The law is the weapon. Before we dive deeper into this, I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. It still amazes me that a story from medieval France can connect us across continents, centuries apart, united by the same questions about justice and power. This is May 1431 in Rouen, the English stronghold in occupied France. Joan of Arc sits in chains, awaiting a verdict that was written before the trial even began. But to understand how they trapped her, how they turned her own honesty into evidence of guilt, you have to go back 2 years earlier to when she was nobody, when she was just a girl from a village so small that most of France didn't know it existed. France in 1429 was a kingdom on life support. The 100 Years' War had been devouring the nation for generations. English armies controlled the north. Burgundian allies held the east. The Dauphin Charles sat in Bourges, uncrowned, watching his inheritance dissolve. Military commanders had stopped believing victory was possible. Parents told their children that French kings were a thing of the past. The war had consumed everything: gold, hope, the future itself. Then a 17-year-old girl arrived at Charles's court with a message that should have gotten her laughed out of the room. She said God had sent her. She said she would lift the siege of Orleans, the last critical stronghold. She said she would see Charles crowned at Rheims Cathedral. She had never touched a weapon. She couldn't read or write. Her name was Joan, and she was about to rewrite the rules of medieval warfare. What happened next defied every strategic expectation. At Orleans, where seasoned English troops had held an unbreakable siege for months, Joan arrived, and something shifted. Not tactics, not numbers, belief. When she rode toward those walls, French soldiers followed her not because she gave brilliant orders, but because her presence said, "This will not fail." And somehow, impossibly, it didn't. Orleans fell. The English retreated. The impossible became real. Victory followed victory. By July 1429, Joan stood in Rheims Cathedral beside Charles as he was crowned King of France. She wore armor. The crowds screamed her name. This wasn't just a coronation. It was proof. Proof that the English could be beaten. Proof that France wasn't finished. A teenage peasant girl had done what kings and generals could not. She had given an entire nation permission to hope again. The English realized something critical in that moment. They couldn't defeat Joan on the battlefield. She'd proven that. Her luck or her divine favor, depending on who you asked, defied probability. So they changed strategies. They would destroy her in the one place her divine mandate couldn't protect her, inside the machinery of theology and law. In May 1430, Joan was captured near Compiègne by Burgundian soldiers during a skirmish. It was almost mundane: one moment rallying troops, the next surrounded and dismounted. It should have been a routine prisoner exchange, a ransom negotiation, the normal rhythm of medieval warfare. But the Burgundians didn't ransom her back to France. They sold her. 10,000 livres tournois to the English. That sum could feed a family for lifetimes. They weren't buying a soldier. They were buying a symbol they needed to annihilate. Here's what made Joan so dangerous even in chains. She was living proof that God favored France. Every victory she'd won validated her claim to divine guidance. If the English could prove she was a fraud, that her voices were demonic, that her visions were delusions, if they could make her testify against herself, then they wouldn't just execute a prisoner. They'd execute an idea. They'd use the law to prove that everything she represented was a lie. In January 1431, Joan arrived in Rouen for trial. On paper, it was an ecclesiastical court, bishops, theologians, church law, the proper procedures. It had the appearance of legitimacy, but every element was choreographed. Joan was held not in a convent with nuns, as church law required, but in a military fortress guarded by 5 English soldiers around the clock. The courtroom was filled with pro-English judges. The lead prosecutor, Bishop Pierre Cauchon, was a man with ambitions. He wanted to become Archbishop of Rouen, and the English had made it clear that convicting Joan would secure the position. For 70 sessions over months, they hammered at her. The brightest theological minds in France versus a 19-year-old girl who couldn't read. She had no lawyer, no advisor, no one who wasn't trying to destroy her, but something remarkable happened. She started winning. Not officially, she was never going to convince these judges, but she was winning in a way that mattered. She was outsmarting them. When they asked if she knew she was in God's grace, a classic trap question designed so any answer would condemn her, she gave one of the most perfect responses in linguistic history. If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me. Flawless. When they asked if God hated the English, she answered, "Of the love or hate God may have for the English, I know nothing. But I do know they will all be driven from France, except those who die here." Not defiant, not reckless, precise. She quoted scripture back at theologians who'd spent decades in universities. She parried every theological trap. They threatened her with torture, showed her the instruments, the rack, the strappado, devices designed to systematically dismantle the human body while keeping the victim conscious. She looked at them and said, "Truly, if you were to tear my limbs from me and drive my soul from my body, I would not tell you anything more. And if I did say anything, I would later declare that you had forced me to say it." She understood legal process better than they did. She understood that torture compromises testimony. They backed down. If they couldn't break her through theology or fear, they would break her through exhaustion and desperation. They would engineer a scenario where being human needing safety, wanting to live, would become evidence of guilt. May 24th, 1431. Joan was dragged to the cemetery of St. Ouen. Thousands gathered. This was supposed to be the day she burned. A scaffold stood ready. Bishop Cauchon prepared to preach her final condemnation. But first, they offered her a choice. A notary stepped forward with a document. The terms were simple. Renounce your visions, admit your voices are demonic, agree to wear women's clothing, obey the church. Sign this, and you'll be spared. You'll go to prison instead of the stake. The executioner stood beside a pile of seasoned wood, ready to burn. Joan was terrified. She'd been interrogated for months, held in chains, surrounded by hostile men. She was exhausted. She was 19. And she signed. Later, Witnesses at her rehabilitation trial held 25 years after her death testified that the document she actually marked was only a few lines long. They said the full confession filed in court records was fabricated afterward, expanded and revised to be far more damning. But in the end, the text didn't matter. The trap wasn't what she signed. The trap was that she signed at all. They marched her back to prison. The crowd murmured, some relieved, some disappointed that this spectacle was canceled. She believed she'd saved her life. She believed the deal was real. Life in prison, that's what they promised. But her captors never intended to honor it. Here's the brilliance of the trap. In inquisitorial law, if you're tried for heresy and confess, you can be spared execution. You get life imprisonment mercy, technically. But there's a second category with no mercy: relapsed heresy. If you confess and then return to your heretical ways, you're automatically handed to secular authorities for execution. No second trial. No appeal. The relapse itself is the death sentence. The English needed Joan dead, but they needed her dead as a relapsed heretic. If they just executed her after the confession, it would look like they'd broken their promise. It would look like murder. But if she relapsed, if she went back to heresy after signing, then everything was her fault. The law worked perfectly. She had her chance and threw it away. They took her back to the same military fortress, still in chains, still surrounded by 5 male guards. They made her wear a dress, the dress that was supposed to save her, but that actually made her catastrophically vulnerable. For months, Joan's men's clothing had been her protection. She testified during trial that she tied her breeches and tunic with dozens of cords, binding them so tightly they couldn't be removed without cutting the fabric. It was armor against sexual assault. Witnesses at the rehabilitation trial confirmed that English lords had attempted to rape her in her cell. The cords were the only thing that stopped them. Now she was in a dress, exposed, vulnerable, in a room with 5 soldiers who knew she was helpless. 4 days passed. 4 days of taunts and threats and promises of what would happen if she didn't cooperate. Then one night, according to testimony from the rehabilitation trial, the guards took her dress. They took it. She was left with only the men's clothes they'd thrown in a sack. She had an impossible choice: face the soldiers naked and defenseless, or put on the forbidden clothing. She chose safety. On May 28th, 4 days after her confession, the judges came to her cell. Bishop Couchin walked in. They found her in men's clothes. Joan explained exactly what happened, that the dress had been taken, that she couldn't defend herself without it, that she had no choice. But then she admitted something else. She said her voices had returned, that Saints Michael and Catherine had come back to her, calling her a traitor for renouncing them, that she should never have signed. That was it. That was the moment the trap slammed shut. By her own testimony in front of witnesses, she had returned to wearing men's clothing, and admitted her voices had returned. Relapsed heresy. The verdict was immediate. She was handed over to secular authorities for execution. Joan didn't understand what had happened. She thought she was being honest. She thought she was explaining her situation. She had no idea she was reading her own death sentence into the record. The judges had engineered a scenario where she had to choose between safety and survival, knowing she couldn't have both. They took the dress knowing she'd wear the clothes. They left the soldiers in her cell knowing what would happen. They counted on her fear. They counted on her honesty. And they weaponized both. May 30th, 1431. 800 English soldiers escorted Joan to the old market square in Rouen. The pyre was ready tall, built with seasoned wood, so it would burn hot and fast. They didn't want this to drag out. They stripped her and dressed her in a white smock. They placed a paper cap on her head that read, "Heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater." She asked for a crucifix. A friar gave her one made of sticks lashed with string, just 2 pieces of wood, but it was Christ. It was enough. She climbed onto the pyre. They chained her to the stake tightly, so she couldn't fall, couldn't escape, couldn't do anything but stand there and burn. The executioner lit the fire. The wood caught immediately. Witnesses reported she didn't scream, she didn't curse. Instead, she called out to the man who orchestrated her destruction, "Bishop Couchin, I die through you." Not an accusation, a statement of fact. Her final testimony to truth. Then she asked someone to hold the crucifix high, so it would be the last thing she saw. As the smoke thickened and the flames rose, witnesses heard her voice above the roar of fire, crying out over and over, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." The name repeated like a prayer, like a promise, like the only truth left in a corrupted world. The crowd watched, thousands of them. French citizens she had saved, English soldiers who engineered her death, priests who condemned her, and then something the English hadn't anticipated. An English secretary who'd been part of the trial machinery watched her body blacken in the flames and cried out in the marketplace, "We are lost, for we have burned a saint." After her body was consumed, they raked back the coals to show the crowd her remains, proof she was dead, proof she hadn't escaped. Then they burned the corpse again, and again. They kept burning until only ash remained. Then they threw what was left into the river Seine. They wanted her completely erased, no relics, no bones, no dust to venerate. But 25 years later, Joan's family demanded a retrial. The Pope authorized it. Over 100 witnesses testified under oath, priests who'd been in the courtroom, judges who'd voted to condemn her, guards from her cell, notaries who recorded documents. They testified to the truth, that the confession was manufactured, that her imprisonment violated church law, that the guards had been systematically abusive, that they took her dress, forcing an impossible choice, that the entire trial was corruption from start to finish. The rehabilitation trial declared the original verdict a fraud. Joan's name was cleared. Within a century she was canonized as a saint. Joan of Arc didn't die because she was weak or wrong. She died because she trusted the law. She died because she believed there were rules that would protect her. She signed a document thinking it would save her life, and the document was the trap. The system that killed her wasn't broken or chaotic, it was perfectly efficient, with multiple fail-safes. It constructed a scenario where being human, needing safety, fearing violation, trying to survive would become evidence of heresy. It weaponized her humanity against her. The judges went on with their careers. Bishop Couchin never became archbishop. He died suddenly years later. The English lost France anyway, and Joan became what they tried to prevent, eternal proof that power, no matter how sophisticated its machinery, cannot burn truth into ash and throw it in a river. Some things refuse to disappear. Some voices once heard echo forever. The fire consumed her body, but the story survived.